Hey, folks, good evening, and welcome to Phantoms Monsters Radio. Thanks for joining me. I want to welcome all new listeners and members to the channel, as well as first-timers in the chat. Now, I'm going to start off with an account that was forwarded to me by a local witness. When a South Central Pennsylvania man was driving on a rural road between York and Harrisburg, when he encounters a hunched-over hairy creature in the middle of the road in front of him. Hi, Lon. Your post on duendes and other little people reminds me of a family friend's encounter. I've told his story a million times, but you said you wanted to know if anyone had any similar stories. It happened to my dad's best friend. He's a friendly, down-to-earth sort of guy, and I've never heard him talk about anything paranormal before, or since he told us this. So, Jerry was driving from York, Pennsylvania to Harrisburg on the Old York Road. He was taking a back road bordered on both sides by super tall pine trees and spruce trees. It was dusk, the type of dusk right before it gets completely dark, and even with headlights, things are hard to see. As he was driving up ahead, he saw what he initially thought was a child walking in the center of the road. It had its back to him, so he sped up a little closer. As he neared it, he noticed the child had a weird lurching walk, as if one of its legs were twisted or injured. Its arms were brought up in front of it, almost the way a kangaroo holds its arms when it hops. Now, when Jerry was neck to neck with it, he immediately realized that it wasn't a child, but some sort of creature covered in thick red hair or fur. The creature didn't stop or turn or even seem to acknowledge the car. It kept going in that weird lurching walk. Now, by this point, it was totally dark out. No other cars had passed during the whole incident, and Jerry was completely freaked out. He said he felt wrong. Like everything just felt so wrong, and his instincts told him to go. So he slammed his foot on the accelerator and sped out of there. I was young when he told me, and my family this. I think this happened in the late 1980s. And I remember I had nightmares for weeks afterwards. Unknown creatures like that really scare me. Ghosts are one thing, but any kind of creepy cryptid type thing is another. I'm always hyper aware whenever I'm out driving on the back roads in the middle of the night now. So I just wonder what it was. Was it a juvenile Bigfoot? Possibly. We got Bigfoot around here, so I don't know exactly what it was. So anyway, let's get started and we'll get into the show and start talking about some of these accounts that I pulled for you tonight.
Of phantoms and monsters. They exist among us, and sometimes they win. Even the devil was an angel once. The world has its own rules, and these rules are not human. Some of us seek answers to the origin and existence of cryptids and the unexplained. Join us as we venture beyond the known and accepted boundaries. Welcome to our nightmare. I think you're going to like it.
So before I get started, I want to mention that this channel is made possible by you clicking on the subscribe and like buttons and by you sharing our programming. Super thanks and super chat donations are appreciated. You can click on the dollar icon located below the chat box, and the Buy Me a Coffee link is also shown below. So thanks for your consideration. Now, your comments are always welcome. Tell me which accounts you found interesting in the presentation or suggestions for upcoming shows. Again, I want to thank our chat moderators, Bernadette, Marla, Thomas, and Mike, for their commitment to me and the channel. Now, if you're in the chat and you have a question, please use all caps. I'll try to get to each one after the presentation. Now, this episode will contain a few of the more bizarre, unexplained, and somewhat creepy reports that I've had received since the previous Weirdest of the Weird edition or episode. Now, every so often, I'll set aside an exceptional account, which I will then present to the listeners. So again, please feel free to comment on the accounts and let me know your opinions. So the first account, a listener recalled an incident that he and his family experienced while living at their ranch near Skinwalker Ranch property in northeast Utah. Hi, Lon. I happened to listen to an older interview you had done about the Skinwalker Ranch and some of the strange things that have been known to occur there. I've been familiar with the general area for quite a long time. I lived near Roosevelt, Utah when I was a boy. My family owned land in south of town. I suppose we lived about 3 to 4 miles from the current Skinwalker Ranch in Bottle Hollow. This was during the 1950s, before the reservoir was built in the hollow. Now, sometimes we'd look east at night and see weird lights coming from the hollow area. So one night, I remember watching a ball of bright white light with a long tail moving along the eastern horizon, then reverse course and go back the other way. My father called it a spirit light and said he'd see many in one night when he was a boy. The most shocking and memorable incident I experienced happened on my 12th birthday, which was in September 1959. Our family was sitting out behind the house enjoying the evening. We had a small party earlier, and the last guest had just left. I had received a refracting telescope as a gift from my parents, and I was eager to try it out. The sky was clear and full of stars that evening. As I scoured the sky, I heard what sounded like men talking. The sound was coming from the gully on the east end of our land. Now, as I listened, I noticed my father walking towards me. He had a very fearful look on his face, like he had just seen a ghost or something. Suddenly, there was a loud whoop sound, and then another. I looked back toward the gully and was shocked to see three tall white human-like figures. The only description I can give is that they were very thin with long arms and legs. Their heads were human, but looked more animal-like as we watched. They were standing still and looking directly at my father and me and with shining black eyes. Then the one on the right raised its left arms and pointed in the direction of the hollow, the area near the current Skinwalker Ranch. My father yelled out, "Leave us be," and the figures crouched to the ground and disappeared. Now, when we got in the house, my father and mother sat me down at the kitchen table and told me that these were spirits of dead Ute warriors who were killed by the Spanish and buried in the hollow. They also said that these spirits protected the sacred native lands and used magic from the heavens to scare their enemies. Now, my parents were very aware of these traditions, even though they weren't Native American. As I grew older, I started to realize that we know very little about the spiritual world and that we know less about the people who lived before us. Now, a woman had experienced several unexplained encounters over the past 35 years. Her father vanished after he had claimed that he was previously abducted. Now, she fears the worst may happen to her. So she writes, in October 1988, a friend and I had an astonishing UFO sighting and encounter. We were both in our sophomore year of high school. I will talk about that incident later in my story, but first I want to relate other experiences. Now, 2 years later, strange things started to happen to me. On my 18th birthday, I went to bed at about 11:30 p.m. All I remember was lying down. Sometime around 3 a.m., I woke up in the backyard freezing and terrified. What I don't understand is if I was sleepwalking, why didn't my parents wake up? I know my mom would have because she had always been a very light sleeper. So after the incident, I couldn't sleep at all for the next 3 nights. So in November 1994, I was living alone in a house that a friend's grandmother had rented to me. One night, I was lying on the couch watching television. Now, after the program, I rolled over and went to sleep. Now, not long after, I was awakened by a very intense bright white lights. At first, I thought someone had pulled into the driveway, and I started to get up to see who it was. I thought it might have been a friend of mine who lived right up the road because he had come to the house late on several occasions because he worked on the second shift. Now, as I was starting to get out of bed to see who it was, an overwhelming terror came over me. I laid back down and pulled the covers over my head. That's all I remember until the next morning when I woke up with my feet on the back of the couch and my head and body on the floor with my shirt on the wrong side out. I had a similar experience in 1996 at a different house in a different part of the country. Now it happened again. Early this morning, at around 5 a.m., I woke and I swear I saw 3 small figures standing next to the bed. It was pitch black because the power had gone out. I immediately rolled back over, put the covers over my head, and thought to myself, I didn't see that. I don't want to see that. After a few minutes and without taking the covers off my head, I reached over to the nightstand and got my flashlight, raised up out of bed, and simultaneously turned on the flashlight. There was nothing there. I was terrified because it felt like someone was in the bedroom with me, even though I couldn't see anything. Oddly enough, as soon as I clicked on the flashlight, the power came back on immediately afterward. I'm not claiming that I had been abducted, but if I was, I simply don't want to know the details. Now, I'm overly concerned that these experiences will continue and that I will eventually become aware that an abduction is occurring. I have never received any communication and I cannot find any marks on my body. The only symptoms I have are insomnia for several days and loss of appetite. But I don't get tired or sleepy. I have noticed that some of the items in the house are moved around, and in fact, a few things have gone missing, including a perfume bottle, a hairbrush, and a blanket. To be honest with you, my real concern centers around my father and the UFO incident in October of 1988. The night I had the sighting and encounter, my father went missing. He had never been seen or heard from again. He had previously claimed that he had been abducted by extraterrestrials and that the beings performed experiments on him. The encounter my friend and I had was very scary and confusing. We have never been able to talk about it with each other, or even though we're still very close. I have an awful feeling something may happen to me and that I may find out what became of my father. I have seen psychiatrists and psychologists for almost 25 years now. No one has been able to alleviate my fear. Now, in this next account, a day of deer hunting in northern Wisconsin turns out to be more than the young hunter bargained for. He encountered 3 unknown men in the woods who turned out to have been deceased. Hi, I was hunting in the northern woods of Ashland County, Wisconsin when I was 16. It was my first time going out and the first time I was left alone with a gun. So, being a teenager, I was excited. We woke at 5:30 a.m. and left before the sun rose above the horizon. Now, arriving on the trail, I walked to my ground stand alongside my brother, cousin, and father. Our stands were all aligned in a distant row, separated by a few hundred feet. Located on the edge of the old logging road, the stands were easy to find. The stands ran perpendicular to the logging road, forming a straight line along the top of a hill in the dense forest. This wasn't our open field type of hunting land. This was real wilderness hunting land. My stand was the closest to the logging road, so upon our arrival, my father helped me settle in before continuing through the dark forest with my brother and cousin. I got situated, and he went on his way. I watched the light of his headlamp disappear into the trees and waited for the sun to rise before loading my gun, as the season doesn't start until the sun comes up. Checking my watch, I saw it was about 6:15 a.m., so I had some time to kill. I decided to spend the next hour or so catching up on some sleep I missed the previous night. Now, when I woke, it was because of a cold gust of wind that had knocked snow onto my lap. I jolted up and immediately checked my watch. 9:30 a.m. I overslept, and God knows how many deer I could have missed. After sulking in my stand, I felt pressure in my bladder and needed to relieve myself. So I picked up my gun, chambered it, and walked backward behind the stand some 150 feet so to make sure there would be no scent for the deer to pick up. I opened my zipper and looked around and did my business. Now, in the dense tree line, I noticed 3 men in blaze orange gathered in a triangle. Now, they all seemed to be talking with each other. At first, I thought it might have been my brother, father, and cousin. However, this was weird, very weird. We have been the only family to hunt this land in the last 50 years. Once I finished, I picked up my gun and unloaded it before using my scope to sight out the group of people. Now, I wasn't hallucinating. It was 3 men huddled together, guns slung on their shoulder. I made sure to take a good long look at every feature I could pick up on. One man wore a thick fuzzy hat that was all orange. Another man sported a stereotypical lumberjack beard, and the final man wore wireframe aviators. As I panned back across the group, the man with the wireframe glasses looked back at me through the scope. I had caught their attention, fearing them to be game wardens. I dropped the scope from my eye. My heart rate hit the roof, and I began fumbling with the magazine I had unloaded. While scrambling to fit the magazine in the gun, I managed to drop my glove in the snow. I bent down to pick it up, and once I looked up, the men were gone. Now, having realized the mistake I had made by pointing the gun at what could be DNR agents, I wanted to find them to explain the situation. I continued through the dense trees and saw the spot where the men had been standing. Arriving at that point, I examined the undisturbed snow. There were no footprints. My heart rate quickened, and I stopped to look around to see if I could see any orange through the brush. There was nothing around me. I was alone with the trees and the snow. I abandoned my search and returned to my stand, anxiously waiting for the end of the day so I could report to my father what I had seen. Once we made it back to our cabin, I berated him with questions. We're the only people that hunt up here, right? Did you, my brother, my cousin stay in your stands all day? Did you see anyone walking around you guys? Because I did. My dad thought I was lying to him, as I was nearly impossible that other people had begun to hunt on this remote land. It felt like I was in one of those horror movies where the main character tries telling the others of the danger, yet no one would listen. My father eventually talked me down, and I relaxed, convincing myself it was a group of new guys who were testing out the land. Before I fell asleep that night, I began to examine the pictures beside my bed. What I saw turned me as pale as the sheet that covered me. 3 men, 3 different pictures. A 4th picture with a 1969 written on the back contained all 3 of the men. They were posed around a giant buck that had bled out in the snow. One man wore a thick fuzzy orange hat The other man had a long, dark-haired beard, and the third man wore wire-rimmed glasses. I sprung up out of my bed with the pictures and confronted my father. "Who are these guys, Dad?" "Oh, you wouldn't know them," he replied, returning his attention to the card game in front of him. "Those are the fellows that built the cabin back in '46 after the war." I felt as if I had gotten much colder after he had said that, but I pressed on. "Who's this guy?" I asked, pointing to the man with the wire-framed glasses. "Grandpa," my dad said. Now, my grandpa had been dead for years, ever since I was 9. In fact, all of them had been dead for years. I will never forget that look my grandfather gave me through that scope. He seemed angry with me based on the way his brow furrowed. I'll never forget that day. Now, in this next account, an Indiana University student is driving at night for an expected 2-hour drive home when she sees what she thought were police lights behind her. They pull off. That's when things got a bit weird. She states, "I'm driving home for the weekend from school at Indiana University. It took me about 2 hours to get home, and I left Bloomington around 10 o'clock p.m. At exactly 10:53, I'm on a rural stretch of 2-lane highway I take home, and I noticed what appeared to be flashing lights behind me. I thought, great, I'm getting pulled over. So I turned onto the next country road about a quarter of a mile from where I noticed the lights. As the car came to a stop and I started to open my glove box to get out my registration and proof of insurance, the lights suddenly disappeared and no car drove past. Now, here is where the story takes a turn for the weird, and I'm sure you guys will think I'm just making this up because it really does seem like something straight out of a typical UFO movie or story. The electronics in my car started to go haywire. The radio was randomly changing channels while the volume kept going up and down, and the dome light in the headlight started to flicker and turn off and back and on. This was at 10:56 p.m. I started thinking to myself that my battery must be failing, or else I have a short somewhere in the electrical system of the car. So I leaned down to pop the hood so I can take a look at the battery, and that is the last thing I remember doing. The next thing I knew, I opened my eyes and saw nothing but night sky full of bright stars. It was a cold night, and it seemed like I had never seen stars that bright in my life. I sat up and looked around, and I saw absolutely nothing. Nothing at all. I was in the middle of a field surrounded by corn stalks left over from the recent harvest. As I started to come to my senses, I started to freak out. Where am I? Why am I asleep in the middle of a field, and where's my car? I got up and started walking toward the distant headlights I could see from the road about a half-mile away. When I got to the nearest intersection, I looked at the signs which read 350 north and 50 west. I was half a mile away from my car, which was just right off the main road. I started walking toward the headlights I could see on the main road. I can't say how long it took me to walk the half mile, but I couldn't have been more than 10 or 15 minutes. When I arrived at my car, all the lights were out and my battery had died, which struck me as odd because I couldn't have been gone for that long. I looked at my phone, which was sitting on the passenger seat, and the time was 2:17 a.m. Over 3 hours had passed since I turned off onto the side road of the flashing lights behind me. I remember sitting in my car completely dumbfounded, wondering what the hell had just happened to me. After about a half an hour just sitting, I remembered that my battery was dead, so I got on the phone and called AAA to come out and give me a jump. It took about an hour for them to get out to me since it was a good distance away from the nearest town, during which time I just sat in silence, running through the possible scenarios in my head concerning what had happened. Now, to this day, I can't tell you what really happened to me that night. All I know is I can't think of any plausible explanation as to why I woke up over a half mile away from my car in the middle of a cornfield more than 3 hours after I had stopped. I have only shared this story with one other person, my uncle. And I'm sure people would either look at me like I'm crazy or that they would call BS on the whole story. And I can't blame them. If anybody came to me with that type of story, closely mirrors the stereotypical encounter story, I probably wouldn't believe them either. Now, in this next account, a humanoid creature jumped into the road and then into the brush on the other side. It was gray, over 2 meters tall, with a small oval head. Its movements were too swift for its size. So the witness states, a few years ago, I met a fascinating man who eventually became a good friend. I'll call him Chris to protect his identity. We both have a military background, so we spoke about some of our exploits in those past lives. He had an unexpectedly haunting story to tell. This took place on an undisclosed military base located in the damp jungles of a remote island. Chris says he remembers the wilderness being unnervingly quiet for at least a week leading up to the incident. The personnel stationed there chalked the silence up to a change in seasons or something. There had been reports of bizarre sightings, fast-moving animals no one could explain. Anyone who mentioned them was typically shut down with ridicule from fellow soldiers. The sightings were notably inconsistent with one another. Some saw large eyes, others saw small ones. Some heard a big thing trudging boisterously through the woods. Others heard something small and light sneaking around the brush. No one had seen anything worth defending in an inevitable argument, let alone losing their reputation. Now, Chris heard every report due to the fact that he was the desk sergeant at the time. Anyone who saw or heard something off, which could potentially impact the security of the base, would typically come to him to have it noted in the log. Now, he never took more fantastical reports seriously, even enough to write them down, unbeknownst to the concerned soldiers who came to him. Some of them just came to talk about what had happened off the record. Anyway, it would typically end up with them just trading ghost stories. On the night in question, Chris and his team were on the far side of the island, a completely uninhabited area. There was no human presence that could be found for hundreds of miles in every direction. For that reason, the military chose that location for storing their weapons and explosives. Chris and his partner, who I'll call Barry, were conducting the nightly checks on the magazine's storage areas, which lay several miles deep into the uninhabited zone. The jungle was still weirdly quiet, but it was good for them, being that their mission was to detect foreign intelligence or operatives tampering with U.S. equipment, or the occasional refugee group that washed ashore. They were on a road that rested in the valley of two mountains bordered by gigantic hills, thick and rocky with tall grass. As they drove along slowly with their Humvee windows down, they heard a heavy thud come from the woods. A totally unexpected, unnatural sound emanated clearly from the tangled growth. Now, the first thud drew their attention, but was quickly followed by other noises. Barry shut off the headlights and shut off the engines so they could sneak up to whoever was out there. They knew anyone attempting to navigate the dense vegetation would have to do so carefully, taking time to avoid injury. But surprisingly, they could hear fast-paced walking rustling through the tall grass. After a few moments, the sound began to move parallel to the road. They restarted the vehicle and started to pursue the noise. The walking continued for a while as they followed it with only their running lights on before suddenly stopping. They at first thought they had lost track of whatever it was, so they turned the headlights back on, assuming it was a deer or something, and continued the distance down the road. Now, as Barry proceeded to turn the high beams on, both men noticed something in the distance approximately 30 yards ahead. A humanoid creature jumped into the road and then into the brush on the other side. It was gray, over 2 meters tall, with a small oval head. Its movements were too swift for its size. The best way he could describe its leaping motion was like that of a possibly nimble frog. Seeing the creature instantly gave Chris the feeling of being punched in the stomach. His heart sank so rapidly and the adrenaline kicked in so fast he began to feel nauseous, on the verge of vomiting. He laments the fact that neither of them had the will to chase after this creature, but that the feeling of being at such a disadvantage was absolutely petrifying. The idea that they were stalking it raised the question, were they hunting or being hunted themselves? Whatever it was, the creature had the tactical advantage of position and mobility. Now, Chris and Barry turned their truck around and sped off into the night. The woods remained silent for at least another week, returning to normal droning sounds of the local wildlife. Now, the U.S. military has several facilities located throughout several island chains in the Pacific. I believe that the area he's talking about and being a special operations base is probably located in one of the many islands in the Philippines, but I'm not sure. They never named the area or the location. Now, a football coach is driving in rural Montana when he sees a hitchhiker. The man is dressed in 1940s style suit with a large hat. What happens next is quite bizarre. So the witness states, my high school football coach told me about an encounter he had while coaching at a small college in Montana when he was much younger and newly married. He said that after practice one evening, he was making his long commute home, and the route ran alongside just fields and fields of hay, grain, and whatever. It wasn't even approaching dark yet, since it was late summer, early fall. His car was an old beat-up truck with just a bench seat. He's driving along when he sees a hitchhiker on the shoulder. This being back in the day in a small town, Montana, my teacher pulled over to let the guy in without a second thought. The man was described as wearing an old, outdated style of suit. Not quite a zoot suit, but styled in a similar baggy way. He also had a big, stylish hat. This man looked like he was out of the 1940s and sort of like a pimp. My teacher thought it was weird that he was so overdressed, it being super hot out, but maybe it was the only clothes that he had. So the guy gets in next to my teacher without a word. The teacher asks him where he needs to go, and the guy just points forward. The teacher drives on. Later, my teacher tries talking to the guy, just trying to make a simple conversation, but the guy wouldn't speak or even acknowledge him. He just pulled his hat down like he was sleeping. Out of nowhere, though, the guy just tips up on his hat, looks out the window and says, "Stop the car now." My teacher pulls over and lets him out, not wanting to offend the possible crazy man. The guy stood on the side of the road for a second, and then in a dead sprint, he ran off into the field beside the road until my teacher couldn't see him anymore. And so he waits there for a while, thinking maybe the guy had the runs or something and didn't want to do his business next to the road. After a long enough wait, my teacher gets back in the truck and starts to accelerate back onto the road. The thing about old trucks is that they don't accelerate very fast. As my teacher got back onto the road, he looked in his rearview mirror to check for a safe merger. But there wasn't a car in sight. What was a hitchhiker on all fours like an animal, crawling after the truck in an inhuman speed. Meanwhile, my teacher is beginning to fishtail as he attempts to go faster. The whole time his eyes glued on the mirror, watching the man chase after his car. Eventually, he was able to get up to the speed and lost sight of the guy in the mirror. When he was able to stop at a gas station to use a payphone, he called his wife at home to tell her the story and to lock up the house. She thinks he's just messing with her. And he had been talking to her, he had been talking to her coworker about the hitchhiker. When she asked why she would think that, apparently at her office in town she worked in, one of her coworkers told her a story of the exact same thing happening to them. And there's a well-known urban legend in that town. She thought it was just folks playing with the new girl at work who had to drive home alone at night. Anyway, my teacher assured her that he was not lying, and she evidently believes him and can vouch for her side of the story because she showed up at one of our fundraisers and I asked her about it. So yeah, now I just avoid lonely roads in Montana. So this next account, a Florida highway patrol trooper who wished to remain anonymous wrote to tell of his weird encounter on a lonely road. And after that, things just start to get a little stranger. So he writes, I'm a Florida highway patrol trooper. This was about 8 years ago when I was a 2-year rookie. I wasn't very familiar with the history of the area where I was working at the time. It starts tragically. I was working the midnight shift and we got a call that a fatal car accident had happened. I head up there and I'm the first trooper on the scene. I checked with the deputies and they gave me the rundown. A naked guy walked out onto the highway right into the path of a semi. Parts of him were here, there, and everywhere, and there's a pickup truck off in the woods about 500 foot back. I'm not long enough to keep my breakfast down, but still new enough not to be completely unnerved by the surrounding by the smell of recent death. Long story short, on that investigation, the man was mentally disturbed. The investigators told me he must have been having a meltdown and crashed his truck into the tree line to commit suicide. When that didn't work, he walked out from the tree line, stripped off his clothes, and just jumped in front of the first big truck that came along. It was a standard night that month. I worked on 6 fatals that month alone. The weird things started happening about a week later. I'm working and I get a call from a pedestrian on the interstate in the same area as the fatal crash and suicide. Routine call, usually some drunk who drove into a ditch and tried to put some distance between him and the DUI arrest, so I traveled the 40 miles up there not expecting to find anyone. I get there and sure enough, there's no one there, so I turn around and start driving away. About 30 minutes later, I got a second call from a pedestrian in the same place. I headed back up there and surprised, nothing. I started driving away. I got about 3 miles down the road and the dispatcher called it back to me again. 2 odd things about that. First, I'm still in the area. And second, I didn't see any cars that could have been calling the sighting in. So I flip a U-turn in the middle of the median and I head back. At that point, I figure it's teenagers messing with our dispatcher or some vagrant trying to hitchhike and hiding from me in the woods. So I pull back into the median and back my car into the tree line and I cut my lights out and started watching the shoulder. After about 10 minutes, right where the suicide had taken place, I saw the shape of a man move from the tree line to the roadside and walk right up to the road. I turn my spotlight on and the whole thing just disappears. No motion, as if someone had run off, just gone. So I put my car into gear and got the hell out of there, and the car just dies. Nothing supernatural about a Crown Vic with 180,000 miles just breaking down, but the timing was real freaky. I started trying to get the engine to turn over. I noticed the trees behind me rustling. Finally, the engine turns over. I put the car in gear, and I head as far away from that spot as I can. A few nights later, I'm sitting at breakfast with one of the old salts, and I tell him what happened, and he looks at me and says, don't go up there alone at night. Back in the 90s, a trooper kidnapped, assaulted, and murdered a woman in the trees in the median. He went to tell me that a lot of guys have had experiences with their cars dying in that area. The whole area just feels wrong when I pass through, even though they ripped up the forest to expand the road. So this next account, a couple is having dinner at a Sacramento restaurant when they are interrupted by pale, deathly looking man. They then notice an employee with unusual fangs. So the witness states, I met this girl on the internet. I invited her down to Sacramento to have some dinner. We were seated at this small round table, kind of facing each other, and suddenly this arm reached over my shoulder to grab my water glass. This guy's arm was so white, it looked like it had all the blood drained out of it. I mean, it was shocking. I could tell by the look on her face that she could see this guy and that it was something. So when we walked around to the other side to get her water glass, when he walked around the other side to get her water glass, I could see this guy. It wasn't just that he looked pale, he looked like he was dead. No, it looked like he was drained totally of his blood. After he walked away, we said, whoa, did you see that? We were just kind of talking about it then. We got talking about other things, and while we were eating our dinner, the maitre d' that had seated us was leaning against the bar about 15 foot away from me, waiting for a customer to come in, and he didn't know I was looking at him, I don't think. From the side, suddenly, he just kind of raised his lips for a second, and I clearly saw fangs. And then maybe half a minute, 45 seconds later, he saw a customer come in the door and he smiled to greet them, and clearly there were no fangs there. I know what I saw. I clearly saw fangs on him, and then the next second they weren't. Couple that with the guy who looked like he had all his blood drained out of him. This was very scary. The girl I was with also noticed odd things occurring as well. We finished our dinner as quickly as possible. We felt so uneasy about walking back to my place that night, even though it was only 2 blocks away, so I hailed a cab. Just a note, there was a bizarre, unexplained death reported at that same restaurant 3 weeks later. I wonder if it was somehow related. Anyway, if you folks got any questions, I want to thank Win Nyes for the $20 donation. Much appreciated. So let's see what we got. Don't have any questions. Now, if you folks want to talk a bit about the Unsolved Mystery episode, I can do that. I mean, that's okay. I know a lot of people in here haven't seen it yet, but I'm not going to give anything away. So, yeah, I don't see any questions. I'll hang here with a second. Peace, I want to thank you for your $20 donations. Very much appreciated. Yeah, I'll talk about that, Lon. Well, you know, I've been leaving hints about this whole episode ever since we did it, which it was actually filmed back in June of last year. So it's been over a year. It seemed like it took forever to get it out there. But I guess, you know, from people I've talked to, it's par for the course. Most of the filming that I did was in Rockford, Illinois, where we had 4 or 5 sightings in Rockford. And that's where we did it. And we did it at an old house, that was part of actually, it was supposed to have been haunted. I'll be honest with you, I didn't feel like the place was haunted, but anyway. Okay. Christine Lehner asks, do you think we live in a dream world? Boy, that's a tough one. I don't think everything's as it seems. Let's put it that way. I mean, we do live in a 3-dimensional world, but I don't think it goes too far beyond that. I know people, I've had people ask me that question before, and I really don't have much of an answer for it. But I think certain people do realize things that others don't. I know I do. And I've met a lot of people that have said that in the past. I'm kind of interested why you asked that question. If you have a specific incident or anything, let me know about it. I'm interested to know. Dagnabbit. A group of miners were blocked from entering a mine by a creature with red glowing eyes and bat-like wings. A short time later, the mine collapsed. Could the Mothman be a harbinger of doom? I don't believe in the whole harbinger thing. I talked about it on the show, but I only talked about it because a lot of people believe it. There have been very few incidents with any real proof that actually happened. The only one, like I said before, the only one I know of, and I mentioned on the show, was the Blackbird of Chernobyl, where the people in that town near the reactor had seen this big black avian flying above the reactor for several days previous to it. But I don't necessarily buy into the whole harbinger of doom thing. Marla Snyder, do you think the guy driving the old York Road could have been an Albatwitch? Yeah, it's possible. I have had Albatwitch sightings reported to me, and I don't know if I talked to you about this before, but I had one down a Red Line reported to me about 15 years ago. I have written about it. And since you're in Red Line, well, I don't know. It could have been an Albatwitch. And for people who don't know what an Albatwitch is, it's a sort of a Bigfoot, but they seem to be shorter. There's an area on the east side of Susquehanna River near Columbia, Pennsylvania, Chickies Rock, and there's some other areas where these beings supposedly get up into the apple trees and throw apples at people. So I don't know. It could have been. I guess, Marla. Paula S., I thought you were great on Unsolved, Lon. Have you had anyone reach out with sightings since the airing? Yeah, we did. And I talked about those. At the time of the airing, I had 161 sightings reported to me. That was a year ago. We've had 8 other ones since then. And I have talked about those recently. If you go back into the archive, in fact, I did a Mothman update just a few weeks ago. So if you go into the channel, I did talk about those. But yeah, in fact, the last one, the most current one was one that was seen in April. In fact, the guy who saw it had seen two previous times, and he literally took his pistol and shot at this thing, but it didn't do anything. I mean, the thing kept going, so apparently it didn't affect it in any way. Sir Wolf, do you think time is linear? I think dimensions are linear. Time, I don't know. It could be, but that's another question. It's, my opinion, I really don't know if it is, but I think there are dimensions linear to our Earth plane. And quite frankly, I think, these winged humanoids may come from that as well, may come from a linear dimension. Christian Later, I'm only saying that living in a dream world because of people seeing strange creators and the dead. Okay. Well, I understand what you're saying. But God, I really don't know. I really don't know. I can sense a lot of different things. Is it a dream world, or is it just a sixth sense of some type or something else? I really can't say. That's a question I had to sit down and really think about, quite frankly. Brutiful said I live in Rockford. I have to try to check that out. Yeah. Yeah, we stayed at the, which hotel was that? It was the new one. It used to be a factory right there on Rock River. That place was fantastic. I'm going to tell you right now. Dagnammit. Do you have any stories on spook lights? Yeah, I got a few. I had to dig them out, but I know I have a few. The Paulding lights, there are some other light phenomena that are seen throughout Texas. There are some in New Mexico as well. Yeah, it's a fairly well-known phenomenon. Savage Grammy, Lon, I have a lot going on. How in the world do you get everything done? I don't know. I'm retired, so it's easier now to do it than it used to be, but it keeps me busy, quite frankly. Dre MF, I missed the interviews, Lon. Will you bring them back someday? I don't know. I have thought about it. I was thinking about maybe doing special guest interviews. Quite frankly, I hate depending on people showing up to do an interview, because there have been times when I have been left hanging and I got to cancel everything. And I have, quite frankly, most of the people I have talked to, and many of them are no longer with us. It's just the same thing rehashed, quite frankly. If I do decide that there's a special guest I want to talk to, yeah, I'll do it. Yeah. I mean, you can send me recommendations, but interviews, I've never really liked doing interviews, but yeah, I had people ask me to do them again, but we'll see. Christine Lehner, interesting that you said creators instead of creatures. Yeah, well, yeah, that's tough to answer, really. Yeah, I don't know. Sorry, I don't have any more for you. Anybody else got any other questions? Okay. I do want to mention Wednesday night, there is going to be a members show. So Wednesday night at 9:00 Eastern, there will be a show for members. So we can talk a lot about the Unsolved Mysteries episode then too. Tangerina Arena. Could the white crawler humanoid creatures be some type of amphibian? At this point, I think they could be anything. Though I'd be quite honest with you, and Short Order Cook's part of this because she's going to do the RV of this phenomena. I got a report out of Northern Ohio of a possible white humanoid or white pale humanoid that this individual has been seeing for the last 6 years, that it may be some type of thought form. So we're going to have to wait and see. I don't want to say too much more because I don't want to put anything in Short Order Cook's head as far as any suggestion, because that, doing an RV, you don't want to do that. But, when we do get some answers to it, we'll present it. But it's interesting. Ryan, what are your thoughts on magic? Is it a thing? Do you think people can actually do magic? Occult, esoteric magic, no rabbit in the hat magic? Yeah, I have done it. Chaos magic. Yeah. I have used it for cases. I do some divination as well. Not recently, But I have done it for cases in the past. I am involved with some people that do use it in investigations and stuff. So maybe that's something we can talk about at some point. Okay. Well, folks, thanks again for coming in here. I appreciate it. Thanks for the donations. If you did donate, it's truly appreciated. Your support's what makes all this possible. So please like, subscribe, and share. And if you have any suggestions, or put them into the comments and let me know. If you have a sighting or a report, send it to me at Lon Strickler, phantomsmonsters.com. So until we meet again, I want to thank you again. Wednesday night, we will be doing the member show. And next Friday night, we'll do another one of these. I'll have to decide what subject I want to cover. So if you want to go to my email or to my Facebook Messenger and make suggestions, please do so. So until then, until I see you again, y'all take care. Have a great weekend. Good night.